The notification came through at 2:47 in the afternoon, and I was still in my truck in the parking lot of the TD branch on Carling Avenue when I read it. A purchase attempt. Declined. My visa. $1,840 at a furniture store in the Rideau Center. I hadn't been to the Rideau Center in months. I sat there with the engine idling and the heater blowing warm air against the windshield, and I read the notification 3 more times. Then I called the number on the back of the card. I spoke to someone named Christine. I told her I hadn't made that purchase. She asked me a few questions. She offered to freeze the card and issue a new one. I said yes to both. Then I sat there a while longer because I already knew. I drove home the long way. Not because of traffic, because I needed the time. When I pulled into the driveway, my stepdaughter's car was already there. That silver hatchback she'd been driving for 2 years now. The one I'd helped her buy when hers died on the 4/17 in January. The front lights in the house were all on. I could see movement through the front window. I turned the engine off and sat in the dark for a moment. My wife met me at the door before I even got my boots off. Her arms were crossed and her jaw was set in that particular way that meant she'd already rehearsed what she was going to say. "Did you freeze the card?" she asked. "I did. Without telling me. It wasn't my purchase." She looked at me for a long moment and something shifted behind her eyes, not guilt, calculation. "She needed it," my wife said quietly. "The crib set she wanted was only available this week. She couldn't reach you. We were going to tell you tonight." I took my jacket off and hung it on the hook by the door. My stepdaughter was standing at the edge of the kitchen. She was 29, 7 months pregnant, and she had the same expression she'd had the first time her mother caught her, lying about where she'd been, a kind of rehearsed innocence that sits just slightly wrong on an adult face. I would have said yes, I told them both. If someone had asked me, "You never answer your phone," my phone was on all day. Nobody said anything to that. I'm 63 years old. I retired from CN Rail 2 years ago after 31 as a locomotive engineer. Long shifts, nights, weekends, 40 below in January, waiting on a platform in Skinna Capriol while the wind came off the lake and tried to pull the skin off your face. I wasn't rich, but I was careful. I'd paid off my house on Baseline Road 11 years ago. I had my pension, my RRSP, and a Visa card I'd had since 1998 and always paid in full. I met my wife at a community kitchen fundraiser 6 years ago, not long after my first marriage ended. She had warmth and patience and a way of making a room feel settled. Her daughter was 23, living with a boyfriend who turned out to be temporary. When that ended, she moved back home. Since my wife and I had just married and I had a 4-bedroom house and a spare room, it seemed like the reasonable thing. 6 months, my wife had said, just until she gets herself sorted. That was 3 years ago. It wasn't all bad at first. My stepdaughter worked part-time at a dental office. She helped around the house some. She was quiet enough. And when she got pregnant last spring, the father not especially in the picture, I told my wife we'd figure it out. Family, my own father used to say that. He meant it as a rule, not an open tab. The first time money got strange was about 18 months in. My wife had suggested we simplify things. She handled the household, groceries, utilities, insurance. It made sense for the household account to draw from somewhere central. I was retired. My pension direct deposited the first of every month. It would just be easier, she said, if we ran the domestic expenses through a joint account, and she managed the bill payments from there. I remember the feeling I had when she said it. Not suspicion, exactly, more like a light unease I couldn't quite name. But I was tired of managing 2 separate sets of finances, and my wife had always been organized, and I trusted her. So I agreed. For the first year, everything seemed fine. The bills got paid, the house ran. When I asked about the account, she showed me the balance, and it looked reasonable. It was my son-in-law, the one my son is married to, a quiet accountant who notices things, who first said something. We were having dinner at their place in Canada last autumn, and he mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd noticed some large e-transfer activity coming through a joint account his firm had advised on for a client in a similar situation. Just making conversation, just being careful. That night I looked at the statements. I hadn't looked at them carefully in almost 2 years. I'd glanced at totals. I hadn't read lines. I sat at the kitchen table until after midnight going through 14 months of transactions. Cash withdrawals at a casino in Gatineau I hadn't visited. Online purchases I hadn't made. A spa in the Glebe. Restaurant charges on nights I'd been home alone eating leftovers. A weekend booking at a hotel in Mont-Tremblant the previous February. I'd been at home that weekend with a bad knee, watching the Senators lose $11,400. In 14 months, I closed the laptop and didn't say anything that night. I went back to the TD branch on Carling the next morning. I asked to open a new individual account. I asked that my pension deposits be redirected there. The woman across the desk, professional, unhurried, asked me if I needed any other changes. I told her I wanted to remove my name as a guarantor from the joint account. She said that would require my wife's signature as well, but that I could, at minimum, remove the direct deposit immediately. I said that was fine for now. I drove home. I was still in my coat when I heard her car. My stepdaughter had arrived an hour earlier. I hadn't known why at the time, but I understood now. My wife walked in and they were both already standing in the living room. Together, like they'd been waiting. The deposit didn't come through, my wife said immediately. No hello, no how was your day? I moved it, I said. You moved it to my own account, she stared at me. My stepdaughter sat down slowly on the couch. You can't just do that, my wife said. We have expenses. We have the nursery left to finish. I know what we have, I said. My voice was steady. I hadn't planned for it to be. But something had settled in me since the night before, some long overdue quiet that made it easy to just say things plainly. I went through the statements, I said. The room changed. My wife's expression didn't collapse all at once. It kind of receded. My stepdaughter looked at her mother. My wife looked at the floor for just a moment, just a beat, before she recovered. Those are household expenses, she said. You never wanted to be involved in the details. I'm involved now. She shifted her approach. We're a family. A spa in the Glebe supports all of us. My stepdaughter spoke for the first time. That was for my back. The pregnancy. I've been in a lot of pain, and I would have paid for that, I said, if someone had asked me. That sentence was doing a lot of work that evening. I'd been saying it in different forms for years without quite knowing it. What followed was an hour I won't try to script out in full, because arguments like that don't move in straight lines. My wife cried. My stepdaughter retreated to her room. My wife came back with a different posture, not apologetic, practical. She wanted to problem solve. She wanted to talk about the baby coming, about what was owed on the nursery, about the cost of a doula my stepdaughter had found, about all the things that would apparently fall apart if I didn't return the money to the joint account by morning. I sat across from her at the kitchen table and I let her finish. Then I said, I didn't create those expenses. I'm not going to keep funding them without knowing what they are. She said I was being controlling. I said that monitoring my own money was not control. She said I was punishing her daughter. I said her daughter was 29 years old. She said that wasn't fair. I said a lot of things weren't fair. She left the room. I made tea and sat alone in the kitchen until the house went quiet. That was the night I stopped pretending I didn't know what had been happening. The weeks that followed had a particular texture, not explosive. The first confrontation had burned through most of the heat. What remained was something colder and more deliberate. My wife became careful in my presence. My stepdaughter avoided the common rooms when I was home. I labeled a shelf in the refrigerator. Nothing dramatic, just a piece of masking tape, and bought my own groceries. It felt almost embarrassing doing that in my own house. But it felt necessary. My wife tried 3 different approaches, roughly in sequence. The first was reasonableness. She proposed a meeting, almost like a mediation. She had numbers, what the baby would cost, what her daughter's mat leave would cover, what the shortfall would be. It was organized and calm, and entirely designed to move the conversation from what had already happened toward what she needed next. I listened. I didn't agree to anything. The second was guilt. She came to me one evening and said that she understood she'd made some mistakes, that she should have been more transparent, that the household had gotten away from her. She said she was scared, that the baby was coming in 8 weeks and her daughter had no partner and the pressure had been enormous. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. I remember looking at her hand, thinking about the hotel in Mont Tremblant, thinking about the weekend I'd sat here alone eating a frozen pot pie from Loblaws and watching the hockey game. I said I understood she was scared. I said that didn't change what I'd found. The third was anger. Not at me directly, she was smarter than that. It came out sideways, in comments about how the house felt hostile now, how her daughter couldn't bring her friends over without feeling judged, how I'd changed since retirement, and maybe I needed to speak to someone. I did speak to someone, my son. Over the phone one Sunday afternoon, out in the backyard where I could talk freely. He listened for a long time. At the end he said, "Dad, you know you don't have to fix everything, right?" I'd been trying to fix things for 3 years without quite knowing that's what I was doing. 6 weeks in, I sat them both down. My stepdaughter had come downstairs looking rough. 3rd trimester rough. Tired in a way that made it hard to feel anything but sympathy regardless of what had happened. My wife sat next to her. I'd made coffee. I poured it without being asked. I told them I wasn't going to restore the joint deposit. I told them that I'd contribute to household expenses directly, a fixed amount each month, transferred on the 1st, for utilities and shared groceries. Anything beyond that was theirs to manage. I told them that when the baby came, I would help in ways I chose freely, not by way of an account that moved money without my knowledge. My wife started to respond, and I let her. Then I said, "This arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. If it doesn't work for you either, we should talk to a mediator." That was the first time I'd said it out loud. It landed differently than I expected. Not with outrage, with exhaustion. Like she'd been waiting for it, and was almost relieved that the shape of things was finally clear. The next month was quiet, in the way that things get quiet before they shift. My stepdaughter had her baby, a boy born on a Wednesday morning in late March at the Civic. I was in the waiting room for 4 hours. When they brought him out, I held him and thought about my own kids at that age, and the anger that had been sitting under everything softened into something harder to name. I drove home alone that afternoon. My wife stayed at the hospital. I sat on the back steps with a coffee and watched the ice going out on the creek at the end of the property. It was that particular Canadian almost spring. Too cold for a jacket to feel optional. Too bright to stay inside. The maple by the fence was just beginning to bud. I wasn't happy exactly, but I was clear. And clarity, I was learning, was better than the particular kind of peace that required you to look away. My wife came home that evening. She made dinner without being asked. We ate without arguing. Something had shifted between us, not resolved but renegotiated, like two people who'd been circling the same hard truth and finally agreed to stop pretending they didn't see it. She said, over the dishes, "I should have told you about all of it. I dried a plate." "Why didn't you?" "Because I thought you'd say no." "I probably would have. About some of it." She nodded. "I know. That's the point," I said. She didn't answer, but I think she understood. We didn't separate. We didn't have a single dramatic ending. What we had was slower and more ordinary, a long renegotiation of what was actually shared between us and what wasn't. My stepdaughter and the baby moved to a 1-bedroom in Nepean 4 months later, subsidized housing she'd been on the waiting list for since before the pregnancy. My wife helped her settle. I built a small storage shelf for the baby's closet and dropped it off one Saturday morning. My stepdaughter looked tired and overwhelmed and more capable than she'd ever seemed in my house. She made me a coffee. We didn't talk about any of it. We talked about the baby, who had an impressive grip and absolutely no opinion about sleep schedules. When I left, she said, "Thank you for the shelf." I said, "It's a good shelf." She almost smiled. Driving home on the Queensway that afternoon, I thought about the person I'd been when all this started. The one who saw a problem and wanted to smooth it over. Who equated keeping quiet with keeping the peace. Who deposited his pension into a joint account and trusted that the person on the other side of the table had the same understanding of shared that he did. He was not a foolish man. He just hadn't been paying attention, not to the statements, and not to himself. My wife and I are still married. Whether that's wisdom or stubbornness, I genuinely can't tell you. But the arrangement is different now, and we both know the terms. My pension goes into my account. I choose what I contribute. I ask questions when something doesn't add up, and I don't apologize for asking. The house on Baseline feels like mine again, in a way it hadn't for a while. Not because anyone left, but because I stopped leaving it in small ways every time I chose not to say something. There's a thing that happens when you're retired and you've spent 30 years being responsible for other people's safety on a 12,000-ton train in the dark. You get very good at monitoring for things that are about to go wrong. You develop a habit of noticing. Somewhere in those first years of retirement, I stopped applying that habit to my own life. I let someone else watch the instruments. I'm watching them now. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever looked away from a number you already knew was wrong, or kept quiet about something because you didn't want to be the problem, I want you to know that noticing is not an attack. It's not cold, it's not controlling, it's just paying attention to what you worked for. And you're allowed to do that. You've always been allowed. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what it cost you to start paying attention. We share stories like this because the quiet ones are often the truest, and sometimes the most useful to hear.